Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Rabbi Yossi, for hosting. I'd like to especially acknowledge the presence of my partner, my soulmate, and Abdullah Antepli, who is my partner in Muslim-Jewish work that we do together through the Hartman Institute. And I'd like to welcome as well my new friend, Mohammed Hashem. Thank you for joining us. So I've been asked to speak about nothing less than power, land, and God. And each of these topics in relation to the Six-Day War and subsequent unfolding of Israeli history would be enough to preoccupy us for the duration of this conference. I've been given an hour. I hope we'll get all the way through. And if not, as we say in Israel, in the Middle East, Elohim Gadol, God is great. So my first trip to Israel was as a 14-year-old boy in late June 1967. Anybody here visited Israel in the summer of 67? So that was the moment that changed certainly my life, and it changed, I think, Jewish life everywhere. I was living in Brooklyn at the time, and my father, who was a Holocaust survivor from Hungary, had two brothers who had survived the war as well and were living in Israel, and whom he hadn't seen since the end of World War II. And suddenly, when the Six-Day War ended, it became urgent for him to get on a plane and go see his brothers. Now, in those years, many of you will recall, air travel generally was quite unusual. It was so unusual that I was the first of my friends to go to Israel. They all came to the airport to see me off, and they were all back at the airport when I returned 2 months later. And that really was the beginning of mass Jewish pilgrimage, tourism to Israel. It begins with the summer of 1967. And there was something in this instinctive Jewish need to be in Israel, to touch what we felt was the radiance of Israel. That was a direct result of this feeling of acute vulnerability that we all experienced as a people in May 1967, in the weeks leading up to the war, and then vulnerability and existential fear giving way to relief when we realized that Israel had taken the offensive, and then relief turning to euphoria when the paratroopers reached the Western Wall on the morning of June 7th, 1967. That summer was the happy ending of Jewish history, or so we thought. And that really was the prevailing sentiment in Israel. We won not just a war, we won 4,000 years of Jewish history, 4,000 years of vulnerability. And now we are the generation that is privileged to be the victors of Jewish history. It's over. It was the end of Jewish history. And we certainly believed there'd be no further attempts, no further military attempts to destroy Israel. And as my 16-year-old cousin said to me, my Israeli cousin said to me that summer, Habibi, you are now in the safest country in the world. Summer 1967. Until the Six-Day War, Israel's existence seemed precarious, tentative. Israel was an embattled, besieged country, barely 3 million people, largely agrarian. High-tech Israel was unimaginable only 50 years ago. There was no US-Israeli strategic relationship to speak of before the Six-Day War. That actually begins as a direct consequence of the Six-Day War, when Israel proved its military prowess. And so Israel goes through this instant transformation from fragility to power, to being the uncontested power in the Middle East. And in my own small 14-year-old way, I experienced something of a similar transformation of power. The photos that I have of myself at the beginning of my summer in Israel show a short, pale, round boy from Brooklyn. And the photos at the end of the summer show a tanned, self-confident young man who miraculously has grown. That was my summer of growth spurt. And I came back to Brooklyn wearing a bullet around my neck, as that's what young Israelis were wearing, teenage boys were wearing in the summer of '67. I bought it at a kiosk, and it seemed to me the most natural expression of what we had gone through. And in some sense, it's understandable, because we went through multiple shocks in May 1967 as a people. The first shock that I remember experiencing was watching the news with my father on TV and watching events unfold, and the armies of 3 Arab countries approaching the Israeli border, and crowds of demonstrators in Arab capitals calling for death for Israel. And I remember thinking that the genocidal threat against the Jewish people had not been exhausted by the Holocaust. That was the first shock that rippled through the Jewish world. The second shock was realizing that we were completely alone. The one strategic ally that we did have was France, and France declared an arms boycott at Israel's most vulnerable moment. And finally, the shock that we all experienced in those days was the sense of the worthlessness of international guarantees for Israel. President Nasser of Egypt calls on the UN to pack up its peacekeeping forces on the border between Egypt and Israel, and the UN complies without any debate in the Security Council. And in my innocence, I had assumed that peacekeeping forces are in place for precisely such a moment, to try to prevent what ended up unfolding. And so we find ourselves alone without international guarantees. And then the victory, which stunned the world, stunned the Jewish people no less. It stunned the Israeli people no less. And I remember this sense of joyful bewilderment among Israelis in the summer of '67. How exactly did we do that? And there were these instant victory albums that appeared. It was the first and last of Israel's wars that produced victory albums. Certainly the Yom Kippur War didn't, and subsequent conflicts. Israel is not a society anymore that revels in victory, and that's an expression of the maturation of Israeli society. But the summer of '67, we were a society that celebrated, that reveled in our newfound power, and that bullet around my neck is the coarse expression of that impulse. Now, a people that feels secure in its power does not need to wear a bullet around its neck. You wear a bullet when you don't feel secure, when you feel somehow that your power, your newfound power, might still be, in some sense, elusive and not lasting. That bullet really reflects a deep imbalance in the Jewish people, to this day, I would say, in our relationship to power. We are, I would go so far as to call us a bipolar people. And I want to juxtapose a few dates to make that point. We went from 1945, the lowest point in Jewish history, to 1948, 3 years later, to reclaiming Jewish sovereignty. We went from May 1967 to that at least an emotional repeat of the experience of the 40s where we really felt existential fear, to June 1967, 3 weeks later, when suddenly we find ourselves the uncontested power in the region. We go from June 1967 to October 1973, the Yom Kippur War, when suddenly all of that Israeli hubris and euphoria collapses overnight, and we are back in a psychological condition of despair and existential fear. If the Jewish people was a patient going through therapy, we would really have a problem. And I say that because we so seldom take a step back and look at ourselves and try to understand the internal communal dynamics, the way we argue with each other about Israeli policies, for example, in the context of our bipolar history. The Jewish experience of the last 70, 80 years is the experience of imbalance, profound bipolar imbalance. We are always weighing, is this an existential moment? Is this not an existential moment? And I know that's certainly true for me, because May 1967 is permanently imprinted in my Jewish psyche. I would divide the Jewish people today into two groups in relation to 1967 and in relation to power. The first group I would call the Jews of May 1967. And they are the Jews who remember most acutely. The memory of 1967 that lingers for them is vulnerability, aloneness, and the realization that power is ephemeral. We have power now, but power, a new constellation of opponents can arise, and the power that we have today might prove to be relative tomorrow. June 1967 Jews argue that a profound transformation in the Jewish condition occurred in June 1967. And we are no longer the same vulnerable people. We cannot continue to give veto power to the traumas of May 1967, to the experience of Israel post-June 1967. And the experience of the reclamation of power imposes moral responsibility on us. We need to take risks for peace. We need to take the initiative. That's very much the June 1967 mentality. And the argument is very simple. Look at Israel in May 1967 and look at Israel today. Today, we are nearly 9 million people. We've tripled our population in 50 years. And I don't even know what that translates in terms of our economic progress. They're two different countries. A majority of the world's Jews will soon live in the state of Israel. 44% of the world Jewish population today lives in Israel. Israel has now outpaced the American Jewish community as the largest Jewish community in the world. And if current demographic patterns continue both in the diaspora and in Israel, we will very soon we will pass the 50% mark. And so it's time, the Jews of June 67 argue, it's time for us to overcome the traumas of the past and to own our success, the success that Zionism dreamed of and actually managed to achieve. Taking this a step further, there are two sources of Jewish anguish today that divide us. The first source of Jewish anguish, and this is associated with the May 1967 Jews, is how is it possible that 70 years after the Holocaust, 50 years after the Six-Day War, the Jewish people is still defending its right to exist, its legitimacy, its indigenousness in our land? How is it possible that we have set the bar so low that if someone says, I support Israel's right to exist, that makes that person pro-Israel. I met with a group of Europeans not long ago who were visiting Israel, and one of them said, I'm very pro-Israel. I support Israel's right to exist. And my response was, I'm very pro-Belgian. I support Belgium's right to exist. And they laughed as well, but a little nervously, because they understood that there was something, wait a minute, you mean it's not enough to say I support Israel's right to exist, and that makes me pro-Israel. The other source of Jewish anguish comes from the June 67 camp, and that is, how is it possible that for the last 50 years we have been ruling another people? We are a people that traditionally defined itself, the fondest Jewish self-definition for centuries was that we are a people of Rachmanim b'nei Rachmanim, merciful children of merciful parents. That was a standard Jewish perhaps self-conceit, but a self-definition. And yet, how is it possible not only that we have been ruling another people for 50 years, but that we have gotten so used to it, that there is so little evident anguish about the occupation among Israelis and among many diaspora Jews. And so the anguish of the June 67 Jews is over how little anguish there seems to be about the ongoing occupation of the Palestinian people. The paradox of 1967 in terms of our relationship to power is that 1967 both opens the door to unprecedented Jewish power and also opens the door to undermining aspects of that power. In terms of our relationship with the diaspora, the Israeli diaspora relationship in 1967, is taken to an entirely new dimension in the love affair, precisely because of the revelation of Israeli power. Diaspora Jews all around the world are walking taller in 1967. And I remember a poster, some of you of my generation will recall this, a poster of a chassid going into a phone booth and changing into a Superman costume. That was a very popular poster among Jewish university students. Think about where Jewish university students are at today. So in 1967, that was a very popular poster. In my doctor's office in Brooklyn, in Flatbush, there was a wall-to-wall photograph, an enormous poster of Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan with his eye patch smiling. This is in a doctor's waiting room. And what's so extraordinary when I think back to that moment is how nobody thought there was anything unusual about a doctor putting a giant poster of Moshe Dayan in his waiting room. And so the revelation of Jewish self-confidence, of our ability to defend ourselves, helped define why so many diaspora Jews fell in love with Israel after 67. Today, of course, 50 years later, power is complicating the relationship. One can argue that Israel has changed, or one can argue that diaspora Jews have changed. Whatever it is, the relationship that Israel really depends on, which is the Israeli diaspora relationship, is eroding. And that is a direct consequence of the Six-Day War, an unintended and unexpected consequence. The threat to Israel's power is paradoxically challenged by Palestinian powerlessness. If the Palestinian people were very powerful, Israel and world Jewry would have much less of a dilemma in how to navigate this relationship. The Palestinians are a profound experience for us of unease. The Palestinians have disoriented us. And the question that Jews ask about the Palestinians is, who are they in relation to us? Are they, to use biblical language, the stranger in our midst whom we are forbidden to oppress? The answer is yes. Are they the counter-claimant to the same small piece of land whose dream is to replace us as the sovereign in that land? I would answer yes. So who are the Palestinians? And what should my relationship be to them? Should I feel guilty? Should I feel wary? Should I feel angry? And so the experience of Jewish power has led to a very complicated emotional dilemma. Before we even unpack the political consequences, the emotional dilemma profoundly disorients us. We don't quite know who the other, the Palestinian, is in relation to us. Though the contradictory role that the Palestinians play in our imagination, and it isn't only in our imagination, in our actual lives, has resurrected a certain political immaturity within parts of the Jewish people in relationship to power. The goal of Zionism, one of the goals, was to teach the Jewish people political realism, to take this profoundly politically immature people, a people that had not known how to wield political power for 2,000 years, and to teach this people once again how to deal with power in the real world. And just to think for a moment about how profoundly politically immature we were only a century ago, think of the vast numbers of young Jews around the world who were attracted to utopian communism as a credible political ideology. And I remember growing up in Brooklyn in the 1960s, there were actually still old Jewish Stalinists in Brooklyn. Maybe you had a few here too. I don't think there were any other Stalinists anywhere except in the Jewish community. And so there is something deep in us that has this temptation for immature, abstract, idealistic politics. And Zionism's goal was to teach us, to be the teacher, that this is how you use power in the real world. Sometimes you need to compromise. Sometimes you need to be faithful to your dream, and sometimes you need to be faithful to the way the world really works. What has happened as a direct result of the Six-Day War is that large parts of the Jewish people have lapsed back into the temptation of utopian politics divorced from the real world. On the right, we see it literally on the religious right with the rise of messianic politics. And so one of the questions when I was working on my book, Like Dreamers, which tells the story of the split between the settlement movement and the peace movement in Israel as a result of the Six-Day War, one of the questions that I had about the settlement movement was, these are serious people. These are serious political, at least they like to think of themselves as serious political people. How is it that the settlement movement in all these years never once had a real conversation among itself about what to do with 2.5 million Palestinians? What is going to be the future of Israel as a Jewish majority democratic state? A question that the Israeli left saw immediately after the Six-Day War. Amos Oz, the Israeli novelist, and one of the spiritual leaders of the Israeli left, wrote a seminal op-ed in the summer of 1967 saying that the occupation will be disastrous for the occupiers. It was all foreseen. How is it that the settlement movement never had this conversation? And I think one of the reasons for that, excuse me, one of the reasons for that is because of the messianic temptation that runs through part of the settlement movement. If the Messiah is imminent, you don't have to worry about a demographic issue. You don't have to worry about what to do with, are we going to give the vote to the Palestinians? Are we going to exclude them? How do we annex the territory? What do we do with the people? The Messiah is coming. And so this temptation of political immaturity, which is antithetical to Zionism, sets in deeply in parts of the Jewish right. And I hear it all the time when I go around speaking, especially in the North American Jewish community. When I speak to right-wing audiences, to Orthodox communities, there's this kind of denial that has set in, a denial of reality. First of all, there's no such thing, we're not occupiers. We're not occupying the Palestinian people. And secondly, there's no such thing as a Palestinian people. And you hear that a lot. You don't hear it so much in Israel, even on the right, but you certainly hear it in the diaspora. On the left, we have a whole different set of messianic utopian politics. And there, what you see on the Jewish left is a profound denial of the deep extent of the denial of Jewish legitimacy, Jewish sovereignty, the right of the Jewish people to have a sovereign state, the right of the Jewish people to define itself as a people, which unites all parts of the Palestinian national movement, from the Islamists to the nationalists. I have spent years in conversation with Palestinians, Palestinian leaders. I have met a few, but scarcely met Palestinian leaders who will say that the Jews are first of all, a people and not just a religion, but will accept the fact that we define ourselves as a people with a religious identity, and that we have an attachment to a specific land, and that we are indigenousness just as they are. We are an indigenous people in that land. And so just as on the right you have the denial of Palestinian legitimacy, on the Jewish left you have a denial of the profound depth of the rejection of the Jewish narrative, and what the consequences of that are for our ability to reconcile, to end this conflict. What also characterizes much of the Jewish left, and here I would say more in the diaspora than in Israel, is a tendency to minimize the severity of the security threats that Israel is facing. That somehow when we speak about a two-state solution, it's abstract, as if Israel isn't dealing with Hezbollah on one border, Hamas on the other border, Islamic State in the north, Islamic State in the Sinai, Iran in the farther background, and a tendency to really somehow treat the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as if it were happening on an island in the South Pacific. Now, on the fringes of the Jewish community, 1967 resurrected profoundly destructive Jewish archetypes, whom I think we believed had more or less vanished from Jewish history. On the far right, we have the reemergence of the Second Temple area zealots, those fanatics who, while the Romans were besieging Jerusalem, were busy assassinating Jewish political leaders and burning the dwindling food warehouses of besieged Jerusalem because it was with the other camp. There is a resurrection of an irrational, hateful zealotry on the far right, which we haven't seen for many centuries. On the far left, we are seeing a resurrection of an anti-Zionist archetype that we thought had disappeared with the Holocaust. Jewish anti-Zionism persisted after the Holocaust, but it was mostly Neturei Karta, Satmar. It was in the farthest extremes of the ultra-Orthodox community. We are seeing a resurrection of in some form of, and in some areas, of classical anti-Zionism within the the reaches of liberal Judaism. We're seeing certainly a resurrection of what was once identified with the Jewish Socialist Bund, a strong anti-Zionism on parts of the Jewish left. And most of all, the resurrection of a particularly odious Jewish archetype, which is the Jew who publicly repudiates his or her community. Howard Jacobson, the British Jewish novelist, lampooned the Jewish leftist who publicly repudiates Zionism and the mainstream Jewish community when he wrote in his novel, was it the Finkler Question? Yes? When he writes about an organization of left-wing Jews called Proud to be Ashamed. And so we are experiencing, as a result of 1967, the paradox of, on the one hand, the growth of Jewish power and self-confidence, and on the other hand, the reemergence of tendencies within the Jewish people, within the Jewish conversation, that are profound challenges to our ability to wisely use this power. The second transformation brought about by 1967 is the dilemma, the temptation of staking our claim to the wholeness of the land of Israel. Pre-1967 Israel, and as soon as I say this, you will all realize how self-evident it is, but when I realized this, it was actually a stunning realization. And that is that pre-1967 Israel did not have a single significant Jewish holy site. There were graves of ancient medieval rabbis, but a truly significant holy site, all of it existed over the border. And so 1967 is the moment when the Jewish people rediscovers the sacred landscape of the land of Israel. And if you think about what the state of Israel was like between 1948 and 1967, how profoundly secular the Israeli ethos was under the old labor Zionist party, the landscape itself of the state of Israel reflected that secular, that attempt to erase a religious dimension to Israeli identity. And it seemed to succeed because the landscape was reflecting that secular ideology. The big shock, the big bang moment in Israeli identity is the moment, June 7th, 1967, the paratroopers, overwhelmingly secular, overwhelmingly from the most secular kibbutzim, reaching the wall and weeping. And this sense of reconnecting with the missing 2,000 years of Jewish history, 2,000 years of diaspora, which the secular founders of the state tried to circumvent. In those years, the culture war in Israel was defined by what one could only half ironically call a struggle between the Israelis and the Jews. The Israelis believed that the state of Israel was something new. It was a break with 2,000 years of Jewish history. And the, quote, Jews insisted that the state of Israel is an organic continuity of Jewish history, and it holds all 4,000 years of Jewish history. The Jews won that argument. If one looks at Israeli society today, Israeli culture, politics, it is suffused with Jewish identity, and increasingly with aspects of religious tradition. And it happens in retrospect at that moment, 1967, with our re-encounter with the sacred dimension of the land. One of the questions that I asked myself as I was working on Like Dreamers was, how is it that the settlement movement proved to be so irresistible to so many Israelis? And I think when we look back and try to understand what happened, that movement to try to claim the totality of the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, it was a convergence of several very powerful factors. First of all, there was the way in which Israel returned to our heartland. And we returned in a war of self-defense. Second, of course, was the power of that claim, both the historical dimension, the religious dimension, and as well the security argument. How can Israel return to the pre-1967 borders that were 8 miles wide when those were the borders from which our neighbors tried to destroy us? Something else that I realized as I was working on Like Dreamers, which is that the first Israeli construction over the 1967 Green Line all happened within a certain pattern. The first building that begins immediately in the summer of 1967 is the reconstruction of the destroyed Jewish quarter in the Old City in Jerusalem. The second reconstruction begins in September of that year, September 1967, in Kfar Etzion, which is the first settlement that's actually built in the West Bank. And Kfar Etzion, it was a destroyed Jewish community, a kibbutz that was destroyed in 1948. And the third Jewish community that's created in the territories is on Passover 1968, and that is in this West Bank city of Hebron. What all three of these communities have in common was that these were all Jewish communities that existed until 1948, which is to say that these are Jewish communities that were destroyed within the living memory of many Israelis. So that initially, at least, the settlement movement was not about an abstract biblical claim of thousands of years ago. It was about re-establishing Jewish communities that had been destroyed in 1948. And that, I think, is, for me at least, that provided a certain understanding of how large parts of the Israeli public were tempted by what I regard as certainly a very politically problematic movement. Many Israelis believed, to this day, that our return to Judea and Samaria, to use the biblical terms, was an act of divine grace. And so if God is in that process, how dare you give up the land? God has given you that land. You don't have the right, even if it's politically expedient. Even, I would go so far as to say, even if it's politically necessary, urgent for Israel to free itself from the occupation. If God has given me that land, how dare I act against God's will? My understanding, well, first of all, there are religious answers to that. There is the well-known halachic ruling by the former Sephardic chief rabbi Ovadia Yosef, that to save lives and to prevent war, one is permitted to withdraw from sacred territory. So that is the kind of technical justification, utilitarian justification for those religious Israelis who nevertheless realize that we need to consider the pragmatic consequences of continuing holding on to the land. I prefer a deeper religious justification for sharing the land with the Palestinians, and that comes from an understanding of the nature of holiness and what a holy land actually means. The biblical understanding of the Jewish relationship to the land of Israel is that we are given custodianship over the land. We are not the owners of the land. That's why built into the agricultural cycle of biblical Israel was Shemitah, where every 7 years you leave the land fallow. The farmer was forbidden to work the land. The land reverts back to itself. back to divine ownership. And every Yovel, every Jubilee, the 49th year, 50th year, you give up all ownership you give up your possessions. You give up your claims. Anyone who owes you money, the Yovel wipes that out. And so what I understand from Shemitah, from Yovel, is that one honors the holiness of the land by not staking an absolute claim over it. And in our time, what that means to me is that we find ourselves sharing the land with a counterclaimant. They wish we weren't there, we wish they weren't there, we're both there. And how do we then honor the sacredness of this land? And my answer is by trying to reach an agreement where we can share this land. How do we do that? Paradoxically, by insisting on our theoretical claim to the totality of the land. You have two claimants who each believe that the whole of this little land between the river and the sea belongs by right to them. That can either lead to endless stalemate, or it can lead to partition, to a conceptual breakthrough. For me, the basis of partition, the moral basis, the conceptual basis of partition, is that it's precisely because you have two claimants to the whole of this land that we each need to contract something of our claim in order to share this, to accommodate the counter-claimant. There are, in effect, in Israel today, three positions in relation to the land. The first is that it's occupied land, and that is really, I would say, a very small part of the Israeli Jewish population. The hard left, which is really dwindling, but the hard left in Israel agrees this is land we conquered, it's not our land. On the other side, you have the right, which believes it's liberated land, and that's the end of the story. The third position is that, yes, in principle, this is our land, but we are occupying another people. I don't believe that as a Jew I am occupying any part of the land of Israel, but I am occupying another people. And because of that, I need to come to terms with their counterclaim. There's a famous Mishnah which talks about two people holding a garment. Each one says it's all mine. You divide it in half. If one says half of it, one says it's all mine and the other says half of it is mine, the one who says it's all his gets 3/4 of the garment. The fundamental mistake, I believe, that the Jewish left makes is in conceding even our theoretical claim to the wholeness of the land. And while we are facing a counterclaim, which is not at all shy about staking its legitimate claim to all of the land. And you hear that from Palestinians all the time. They say, we've already lost 79% of historic Palestine, we can't compromise on any more. So my response is that if and when we withdraw, I am not withdrawing from occupied territory. I am withdrawing from Judea and Samaria. That will be a profound trauma for me as a Jew to have to give up that land. And yet, if I'm expecting Palestinians to give up their claim to Haifa, I need to give up my claim. The practical expression of that claim, never the theoretical claim, but the practical expression of the claim to the land that will be a Palestinian state. Now, I was just told that I have 5 minutes left. Can we make it 10 and I can slip God in to the end of this? I'll take that as a yes. So the third factor impacted by the Six-Day War, the Jewish relationship to God, and really, God forgive me for sliding, by trying to to condense this into 8 minutes. But something about how the Six-Day War changed the Jewish people's relationship to God. My father emerged from the Holocaust refusing to pray to God. And what he said was, God doesn't deserve Jewish prayer. Now, I really love that response because it's very Jewish. What my father was saying is not, I don't believe in God, and that's why I'm not bothering to pray. He was saying the opposite. He was saying, of course I believe in God. Of course God is God. But God betrayed us. God could have stopped this, and he didn't. And so I'm boycotting God. BDS against God. This was a very widespread response after the Holocaust, certainly among the survivors, but among many Jews as well, if not acutely, certainly passively. A sense of, this Jewish idea that we had of the omnipotent God who loves the people of Israel, there's something that we didn't quite get right in that understanding. And so there was a deep retreat from God. Now, this retreat, of course, begins in the 19th century in Europe. And the Holocaust really takes this to the next level, so that in large parts of the Jewish community, even today, God conversation is awkward. And many people come to synagogue or temple, not necessarily for God, but for Jewish communal purposes. My father made his peace with God at the wall in the summer of 1967. And he said, God has shown that he is ready to protect us again from harm. Now I can forgive God. And he actually became a devout Jew. What that story is about is the return in Jewish consciousness of the biblical God. The rabbinic God is the God of withdrawal, of hester panim, the God who hides his face, who is not actively involved in history. The biblical God is the God who splits the waters, the God who takes his people out of slavery and brings his people into the land. And so something of the biblical God is resurrected in the Jewish imagination in the Six-Day War. The danger, of course, and we see this in parts of the Jewish community, is that you begin to associate God with the policies of a secular state. You begin to imagine that God is giving us a blank check. To some extent, I think it's unavoidable that we see the return of God to Jewish history. And a people that carried for 2,000 years this fantastic notion that one day Jews would be gathered from dozens of countries around the world. The most powerful people, powerless people, would suddenly, somehow, come back to its land, something that never happened to any people in history. And then we see it happening under the most unimaginable circumstances. It is unavoidable that the Jewish religious imagination will acknowledge the presence of God in our story. Not only unavoidable, but from my point of view as a religious Jew, essential. And I always marvel at Haredim, ultra-Orthodox Jews, who will speak about divine providence. If you find a dollar bill on the street, oh, that's a gift from God. And yet the ingathering of the exiles from 100 countries, the empowerment of the Jewish people, the restoration of Jewish sovereignty, that we're agnostic. Maybe not, who knows? So the logic, the internal logic of Judaism demands a serious reckoning with the place of God in our story. The question, and with this I will conclude, the question is which God? Which is the God that we are welcoming back into Jewish consciousness after a period of estrangement? Is it the God of the Bible? Is it the God of the rabbis? Is it the God of the Kabbalists, which is much more of an intimate experience? It's the God of the mystics, the God of the Hasidim. And that, I would say, is one of the seminal issues defining the conversation in Israel today, certainly in the Orthodox world in Israel, but not only. Which is the God that we are celebrating, that we are re-enshrining at the center of our identity? And how that debate is resolved will help determine how we navigate the uses of power, and also resolve our anguished dilemma over the future of the land that we won in 1967. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yossi. Thank you all. We're going to take a short 5-minute break, stretch the legs a little bit, have a little nosh, come back in. For this next session, we've got 2 options. The first is going to be a conversation between Yossi Klein Halevi and Abdullah Intepli of our Muslim Leadership Initiative on Jerusalem and the way that they both see Jerusalem. Next door, if you're looking to have some time to process some of what you've heard from Yossi and looking to have an open conversation, Naomi Adlin from our office is in the chapel, which is next door. You can grab a little nosh, eat it in the hallway, and then join us for the second session. We're going to begin in about 7 minutes.